All right, so this training is going to be over DOT shippable containers. Basically, don't take a risk. Use salvage packaging when in doubt. And we'll go over why I keep saying salvage packaging. Most of us are used to overpacking, is generally the term that we've used in the past, and we'll go over why it's technically called salvage packaging. But first, you really need to determine, is this drum or is this waste container DOT shippable? You need to determine this before you load that waste up for transport. Most of the time, the judgment call as to whether salvage packaging is required is going to be common sense, as you can see from these examples. The first one is this majorly dented drum. So if you see any drums or waste containers or totes, if they've got huge smashes in the side or they're dented, then you don't need to pick that waste container up as is. Either we're going to have to salvage pack the drum, or if it's a tote, we're going to have to transfer it into a DOT shippable tote. No, denting is not acceptable. Same with bulging. If anything is bulging, a drum, a 5-gallon bucket, a tote, that is not DOT shippable. That means there's pressure inside, which, you don't want that thing blowing up in the back of your truck. If it's excessively rusty, if it's very rusty, we need to salvage pack that because that indicates that there's, some issues with integrity of the waste container. Check the lids. If you're missing bunghole covers, if you're missing rings, if the rings are rusty or they don't fit right, those are all issues. Those are all things that make that waste container non-DOT shippable. So when in doubt, use salvage packaging. We are pretty familiar with what that looks like. These are some different sizes and variations of salvage packaging. We've got 4 different types of polys, and we got a metal one there. 2 things when you're choosing, which salvage container should I use. If it is corrosive, if it reacts with metal, you're going to want to use those poly containers. If it's a flammable, generally you'll want to use the metal container. Usually you're going to be safe with those polys. That's what most of us have, is a ton of those polys, which is fine. If there's a special circumstance where we really need to use the metal one, then we will. So you should have some of those on hand as well. Another big thing is to make sure that whatever salvage package you pick is large enough to fit that drum you're trying to overpack, or salvage pack, I should say. See, it says overpack right here. That's wrong. And I had to go back and change all of this once I started doing some research, and I'll tell you why. Technically, these are not overpacks. They are, but they're salvage packaging, is the technical term. But anyways, you'll want to make sure you pick one that is large enough to fit your drum. You don't want to get in a situation where you put the drum in there and you flip it to put the lid on, and then the lid doesn't close. Pick one that's large enough. And this is where I'm going to just explain why I keep saying salvage packaging instead of overpacking. Overpacking, by definition, it's described as an enclosure used by a single consignor, which I guess is the generator, to provide protection or convenience in handling of a package or to consolidate 2 or more packages. So overpack examples include 1 or more packages. So that'd be like placed or stacked onto a load board, like a pallet, and then shrink wrapped, or placed into a protective outer packaging like a box or a crate. So there's a photograph of technically what, by definition, is an overpack. Then you've got salvage packaging, which is truly what our poly and metal salvage drums and packages are. These are special packaging for the transport, recovery, or disposal of damaged, defective, leaking, or non-conforming hazardous material packages or hazardous materials that have spilled or leaked. So obviously that fits our definition. Salvage packaging is intended solely for the use of hazmat packages that are shipped for the transport or for the purpose of recovery or disposal. So if you've got damaged, defective, or leaking containers, non-conforming containers, so if they're dented, bulging, hazmat that has spilled or leaked. So basically, overpacks can be salvage containers, but not all of them are, basically. So it's okay to call them an overpack, that's fine, but when it gets down to nitty gritty, really, they are salvage packaging, salvage containers. Okay, here's a video, just kind of, this is one way to do a salvage pack.
There you go.
I don't like how it's spilling all over the place, though.
Good.
Wow. There you go. And then this is also another way to do a salvage pack. And I guess this would be, which they call it an overpack, which is fine. But this is called the inversion method. So I guess this would be if you had drums that weren't very heavy. Because when you see this guy load them, I mean, the drum would have to be pretty light in order to do this. Yeah, he just like rolls it up on there. So, but that is another method. Maybe not quite so violently. Okay, so he screws it on. There he goes, using his knees. Ta-da! So that's another way to do it. Basically, just whatever way that you can do it without spilling it everywhere. That's why I don't really like that first example, but that's usually how we have to do it in order to get in there, because usually our drums are full and very heavy. Okay, so we'll just kind of run through some examples of drums that are not DOT shippable, which all of this is pretty obvious, but I have seen people roll up to the yard and drop these in the waste area, and I'm like, what is that thing? I mean, you know, stuff that looks just as bad, if not worse, than some of these. So it's really important, you know, that we understand it's okay to stop and say, hey, I can't transport like this. We'd rather have you stop ahead of time and say, hey, I need an overpack. I need a, you know, salvage drum. I can't transport like this. That's totally fine. We'd rather have you do that than have an accident on the roadway or bring something nasty like this back to the yard. So this example, rusted, bad lids, there's no rings. This one is bulging and leaking. I mean, got a huge bulge right there. These are all rusted. Bad lids, there's no rings. So all of these, either rusted, bad lids, no rings, you would need to salvage pack all of those. Okay, these are pretty obvious. This one's the back. This one's like busted off, so clearly not DOT shippable. If you see free liquids sitting on top, that is also not acceptable. That could slosh and spill into your truck. If you see substantial drips and dribbles, that's also an indication that, you know, the drum is possibly overfilled, which is also an issue. So you'd want to take note of that. You know, these lids are very rusted. This one doesn't look like it has a ring. Maybe it has one. I don't know, but it's really rusted. So those are not DOT shippable. All of these little containers, all of these cans, that clearly is not DOT shippable. With this kind of stuff, where it's sorting, you don't want to just throw all that into one drum and be like, here you go. All of that has to be sorted. It has to be categorized by hazard, by waste classification, you know, to make sure that incompatibles are not being mixed. So you would never just want to show up on a job like to a school or to an old warehouse and like just start loading their stuff up like this, because that's, first of all, none of these containers are DOT shippable as is, and second of all, you know, there needs to be some organization in terms of what kind of containers you're using to package them to ship. And, you know, these aerosols, obviously, you know, I wouldn't think someone would try and load those up, but you never know. More examples: dented, leaking, rusted, bulging, no bunghole covers. You know, that's a big one, is not having the bunghole covers or not having rings. So that's something that you would need to pay attention to if you're going out on a job. Coming to the end here, basically the biggest DOT shippable points. It's better to use salvage packaging if the drum or waste container appears sketchy in any way. And like I said before, that includes totes. If there's a dented tote, it's a bulging tote, don't pick it up like that. If we have to go back out and repackage it and transfer it into a new tote, that's fine, but don't just pick it up. The point is to ensure that all the waste containers we haul are DOT shippable and that they're not a spill threat during transport or when we're trying to load or unload that container. Because, you know, there's going to be a lot of handling. By the time you pick it up, we have to bring it back to the yard, unload it, you know, or take it to wherever we're taking it, unload it, reload it. It just, you know, it doesn't do anyone any favors. The lid should be structurally sound and closed tightly with good rings. Bung holes should always be covered. For smaller items like 5-gallon buckets, 1-gallon containers, these items need to be repackaged. You know, unless it's like a really solid container, but that would have to be a case-by-case basis. And generally, those should not be shipped as is. Compatibles need to be placed together. You shouldn't attempt to categorize one of these crazy jobs alone. You really need to get with Waze for lab packing items, which is loose packing smaller containers into a drum, a cubic yard box. Always get with somebody and make sure the right things are going together, because you don't want to have two things spill in transport and have an explosion on your truck. Like we talked about, for any sized poly tote, they also should be inspected for structural integrity. And if the tote is dented, smashed, if the cage is damaged, then do not pick it up or transport it. That's when we need to consult with waste, and we need to game plan where we're going to go from there. And really what it comes down to is your choices on DOT shippable containers affect all of us. Like, I can sit here and tell you this all day long, but if you or someone isn't listening, or they just decide to do whatever and they pick up a crummy tote or drum and it ends up leaking or releasing, or combining with the incompatible when you're trying to transport it or load it or unload it, then we could potentially have a major issue. We could have a spill, an explosion, and then we have to report it to TCEQ, EPA, or the city, in addition to the customer whose waste that was. So it's just a huge issue overall. So we'd rather have you stop, assess the situation, and repackage if that's necessary. So, like I said, just use your common sense.